I will eat this cake. Hey, where are you going? Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Okay, so the story I'm about to tell you is going to sound completely crazy. But, as myself and the others that experienced it with me will assure you, it is entirely true. Anyway, my name is Connor. I have 3 very close friends named Sean, Kyle, and James. We all live in the Creignish area of Nova Scotia. A few summers ago James was going to visit his grandparents in Creignish, Cape Breton for part of the summer, and invited the 3 of us to come with him. We hadn't had anything interesting planned for the summer, and it would only be about an hour and 15-minute drive from home. So we agreed to go on the trip. Kyle's sister Emily, who was a year younger than us, decided to come too. The rest of us were 15 at the time. When I say James' grandparents lived in Creignish, I mean they lived on a sort of back road in the area. James' grandma drove us there. There wasn't much room in the van, so I only brought what I felt necessary, a few pairs of clothes, a toothbrush, and my Game Boy Advance with a few games. I tried to take in as much of the landscape as I could on the drive. I was used to living in the middle of town, so I liked seeing the sights for once. James, who was sitting next to me in the back seat, informed me that his grandma's name was Mary and his grandpa's name was Danny, so I'll be referring to them by those names. When we arrived at the house, it was already about 6 o'clock. Mary suggested that we settle in after we eat supper. Mary made mashed potatoes and ham, and we all sat down at the dinner table. After supper, we realized there were only 2 spare bedrooms in the house, but Danny told us there were 2 spare beds in the shed we could sleep in. Now the shed wasn't old and cramped like it may sound. It was more like a finished garage, so we would be comfortable. Sean and I agreed to sleep in the shed. The nights were very hot that summer and it would be cooler out there. James and Emily chose to sleep in the 2 spare bedrooms, and Kyle decided to sleep on the couch. Shortly after we had settled in, we went to bed. The first few days in Creignish were pretty chill. The second day there, we all drove into town and Mary showed us around. We stopped at the convenience store and each got a Coke. Unlike Creignish, this town seemed a lot more connected, I guess. Everyone seemed to know each other. I guess it was because it was a smaller community. On our 4th day there, we walked down to the beach to go swimming. It was a pretty long walk, but Mary and Danny were busy and none of us were able to drive. Anyway, I thought we needed the exercise. After walking for about half an hour, we arrived at the beach. It was about 6:30 p.m. now. We were swimming there for a couple of hours, and then I took a break. And that's when it started to get cold. Not like a cold breeze, there wasn't a breeze at all that day. It was just cold. It was unnatural, because like I said, it was a hot summer, and it didn't cool down at night. It was starting to get dark at this point, and that, combined with the sudden drop in temperature, let us know it was time to start walking home. The walk seemed to last forever, and as we walked on, it was getting colder and colder. I was really regretting not bringing a hoodie. By the time we made it back to the house, I could see my breath. We were all kind of freaked out about the sudden change in temperature, so we all decided to get ready for bed. It was a little early to go to sleep, so I decided to play my Game Boy for a while. I don't think I was 3 minutes into playing when my Game Boy died, and I was left in complete darkness, except for a bit of moonlight coming in the window. My Game Boy had been charged just the day before, and I hadn't been using it enough for it to run out of charge then. I was puzzled, Then I thought about how fast it had gone from hot to freezing earlier, and felt a feeling of dread pass over me. Something wasn't right. I set my Game Boy in my bag and told myself I'd figure it out in the morning. After what I think was about 10 minutes, I felt myself drift off to sleep. I was woken by the screeching of some animal. It was like something I'd never heard before, like in between a human and a bull or something. I guess it didn't sound human, almost as if it was trying to sound like a human screaming, but you could still make out that it was an animal. It sounded like it was right outside. I didn't want to move, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I walked to the window. The shed felt even colder than it had when I'd gone to bed. The window was a bit higher than I could reach, so I got a footstool and stood on it. I lifted my eyes up to the window, and my heart sank. There was something out there, standing on two legs and covered in fur. It fit the description of a werewolf that you'd see on TV. Then it turned around and stared right at me. I only saw its face for a split second before I ducked beneath the window, but I'll remember it for the rest of my life. It had the face of a dog, but with the snout of a pig, and red eyes that seemed to glow. It looked like they were glowing because they seemed to be illuminating its snout, as the snout had a red tint on it. I could see huge fangs at the sides of its mouth. When I backed up away from the window, I almost fell off the stool. I immediately closed the curtains and ran to the door to make sure it was locked. The screeching of the creature must have woken Sean up, because the next thing I heard was him yelling, "What the heck is that noise?" And I half ran, half crawled to the side of his bed and told him to be quiet. As I described what I saw outside, his eyes widened with fear. I knew he believed me because he knew I would never lie about something like that. I got back in my bed and hid under the covers. And then I listened. I could hear it moving around in the grass, and every few minutes it would let out another screech. I must have dozed off after that, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I immediately tested the lights to see if they were working. They were fine. I got my Game Boy out of my bag and turned it on. It was working too. I was confused and thought that maybe the power dying and the drop in temperature was connected to that thing I had seen outside the night before. I turned my Game Boy off and set it back down. I sat on my bed thinking about everything for what must have been a few minutes, and then Sean woke up. We opened the door and started towards the house. Sean turned around and started to say something to me, but he immediately stopped and stared right past me, back at the shed. I turned around to see what he was so freaked out about, and I instantly felt the same feeling I had felt the night before when I looked out the window. The door of the shed had scratch marks on it. Any thought I might have had about it all being just a bad dream went away at that moment. I felt like just going into the house and forgetting about it, and even though the sun was up, I felt a little uneasy being outside. I started walking towards the house again, and Sean did the same. He must be thinking the same thing as I am, I thought. When we walked into the kitchen, everyone was already eating breakfast. "Sleep well?" Mary asked. "Yeah," I lied. I looked at the clock on the stove. It was 8:45. We sat down at the table and didn't say anything about what had happened the night before. I was halfway through my bacon and eggs when Kyle broke the silence. "Did anyone hear anything last night?" I almost choked on the egg in my mouth. He continued on saying that he'd woken up at like 3 in the morning to the sound of some animal that he couldn't recognize, and how it had kept him awake for at least an hour. That was when I told them everything, about the power on my Game Boy, the screeching, the creature I had seen, the scratches on the door. Everyone looked at me like they were trying not to believe me, but they knew I was telling the truth. Then James admitted that he had heard the noises too, but was too scared to look out the window. I would have thought that Mary and Danny would dismiss these stories as figments of our imagination, but even they looked concerned. We finished breakfast without talking about it anymore, and for the rest of the morning, we tried to forget about it. The day went on like any normal day after that. We didn't go anywhere but just chilled around the house all day. Then at about 6:45 in the evening, the others decided they were going to have a fire that night. I was a bit reluctant to agree to it, but I didn't want to ruin their fun. We started collecting sticks and got some hardwood from the pile behind the shed. Right when we were about to start the fire, storm clouds started to roll in. Shortly after that, it started to rain, and we all ran inside. Thunder came a few minutes later, and it was starting to get dark. We all sat in the living room talking and telling stories as if we were having the campfire indoors. About an hour after the storm started, the power went out. Mary ran and got candles from another room, and we lit them and started telling stories again. After a few other stories, James was telling a scary story when it started getting cold again. Mary and Danny were in bed when we got home the night before, so they didn't know how cold it got. But the rest of us knew exactly what was going on. It got cold way faster this time, though. Only about a minute and a half after the cold set in, I could already see my breath. Then I looked outside, and the same feeling of dread washed over me once more. There were two red eyes staring at us through the window only about 30 feet away. Sean was sitting next to me on the couch, and I tapped him on the shoulder. He looked out the window and saw them too. At this point, everyone had realized what we were looking at and had seen the eyes for themselves. Then, as everyone stared at the window, there was a flash of lightning, and in that instant, everyone saw it. It was the exact same creature I had seen. It let out a screech, and everyone was petrified with fear. Lightning flashed again, and this time it was at least 10 or 15 feet closer to us. Everyone just booked it out of the room, up to the stairs without thinking twice about it. We hid in Mary and Danny's room and listened. The window in the living room smashed open. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but Kyle put his hand over her mouth to silence her. We could hear it moving around in the kitchen, knocking pots and pans off the stove. That's when Danny told us to slowly open the window, and he crawled to the bedside table to get the car keys. We opened the window and everyone climbed out one at a time and dropped down onto the roof of the porch. Everyone slid off the roof onto the ground. Normally I'd be too scared to jump off a roof, but right then I didn't really care. We ran to the van, and everyone got in within a few seconds. Danny tried to start the car, and it just wouldn't start. He tried everything, but it just wouldn't work. Mary said we should try to call 911 on our cell phones. That won't work, I assured her. Everyone tried their phones anyway, and sure enough, none of them would turn on. I said we should all just forget about everything else and start running, and then maybe we could get to town and get help. No one wanted to be walking to town in the middle of the night with some creature following us, but nobody could come up with any better idea. We all jumped out of the van and sprinted as fast as we could away from the house. I caught a glimpse back at the house right before it vanished from my line of sight, and that thing was staring at us from the window we had jumped out of. That just made me run that much faster. About 5 minutes later we got tired of running and slowed down a bit, convinced we had lost it. For the rest of the way, we would walk for a bit. Then someone would look back and think they saw something, and we'd start running again for another few minutes or so. It felt like we'd been walking forever when finally we saw the lights of the convenience store and ran as fast as our legs could carry us to the door, thanking God that we had made it. Before I went inside, I looked back once more, and I saw the eyes. It started at me for a few seconds, and then the eyes went off to the side and disappeared, as if the creature had turned around and walked away. When I went into the store, I didn't tell the others what I'd seen. I didn't want to scare them any more than they already were. We explained to the guy behind the counter what had happened and that we needed to use the phone. He looked at us in disbelief, but since we all looked so shaken up, he handed us the phone right away. Mary dialed 911 and told the police what had happened. They didn't sound like they believed her, but told her that they would pick us up and let us sleep at the station that night. Then they would drive us home and check the place out in the morning. They must have heard the fear in her voice. While she was on the phone, the rest of us noticed that it wasn't cold anymore. I didn't remember when it had gotten warm again because we were all too scared to think about that before, but I assumed it must have been when we had reached the town, because the power was on everywhere there. An officer picked us up and brought us to the station. They gave us a place to sleep and we went to bed right away. As I was falling asleep, I thought about everything that had happened. Then I drifted off. I woke several times during the night, unable to get restful sleep. I felt like that thing was watching me, or that it knew where I was. We all must be pretty paranoid, I thought. I woke up for good at 5 o'clock in the morning. Everyone else was still asleep, and I guess the sheriff thought of this as a golden opportunity to find out more about the creature. He asked me to sit down in his office. "So I hear you were the first to see this creature?" he asked. I nodded. He proceeded to ask me to describe the creature and where I had first seen it. We talked for about an hour and I explained everything that had happened. He just stared at me with a neutral expression while I talked, like he didn't believe me or doubt me. Once we had finished talking, I walked out to the front of the building. Everyone was up at this point. We drove back out to the house with the sheriff and a few more officers. There were no signs of the creature, but the scratch marks on the door of the shed, smashed window, and tons of stuff ripped up inside the house showed that there had been something around there. The scratch marks puzzled the sheriff because they didn't match any animal anyone had seen before. After the police had done their search, they left and Sean, James, Kyle, Emily and I began packing up. Mary and Danny didn't want to make us stay any longer after what had happened. We put our stuff in the back of the van and said goodbye to Danny. We got in the van, and Mary was able to start it without any problems. James started talking to me about something, I don't really remember what it was, and we started moving. As we drove off, I took one last look at the house through the back window, and there it was, standing at the edge of the woods, looking directly at the van. I locked eyes with the creature for a moment, and then it turned around and walked away. I remember thinking it was like it was saying goodbye in a way. That's the last time I ever saw it. And that's pretty much where our story ends because nothing has really happened since then. A few days after we all went home, the police searched the entire woods. There was no sign of the creature anywhere. James has been back to visit his grandparents several times since that summer, and neither Mary, Danny nor James have had any encounters with the creature. But, recently, I found an article that I think could explain our entire experience. Ever since people started immigrating to Creignish area in the 1700s, there have been reports of encounters with a certain spirit that draws energy from numerous sources to be able to exhibit a physical form. Encounters are usually preceded by a sudden drop in temperature and, in more recent cases, loss of power in various devices. The spirit usually shows itself as a large wolf-boar hybrid that stands on two legs and has glowing red eyes. I know it's still out there, somewhere. Even when we can't see it, it's there, watching our every move, and at any moment, it could come back to terrorize us all.